Centre West Midlands, we're very keen to sort of share information to our healthcare professionals as well as patients in the longer term, to try and think about, of course, medication safety more generally. This is a slightly different topic to the ones I've done in the past, in terms of we thought it would be useful to try and look at the licensing process. I'll share my screen in just a second. As Christopher said, I'm a professor of clinical pharmacology. I'm an active practicing physician at University Hospital Birmingham's NHS Foundation Trust. I'm also actually one of the commissioners of human medicines, and I'll talk a little bit more about the commission in a short while. But over the last few years, working with the MHRA and working more generally with the ADR Centre, obviously built up a knowledge of the process. So I hope that this is sort of useful, because actually many people will know that, of course, drugs get from the chemist's mind to the chemist's shop, but may not understand exactly all of the processes behind it. I've called it licensing medicines, the 3 hurdles. Christopher, can you just confirm you can still see my PowerPoint slideshow? Is that okay?
Yep, that's fine, Jamie.
Brilliant. So what I want to do is take us through a little bit about the history of medicines regulation, and then talk more about the UK National Competent Authority, the MHRA, routes to getting a license or a marketing authorization, which is the proper term for it, and how that's reviewed, and particularly talk about types of application, how that's changed from, dare I say, the B word, I've put it below, dare I say, Brexit, you know, the challenges that I suppose we have in terms of bringing drugs to market in Great Britain as we now exit the EU. Concentrating a little bit, I suppose, is why would the Yellow Card Centre want to talk to this audience about it? Well, it's all about actually, of course, managing the risk of both drugs pre-marketing authorization, but of course post-marketing authorization. So I'm going to concentrate a little bit on sort of the pharmacovigilance aspects, giving you an opportunity to ask questions towards the end. As Christopher said, please type them in the chat box so that I can see them afterwards. The views are my own. I think all of the information that I put on the slides is not restricted information. It's all available on the websites and from official documents. And as I say, forgive me if I make any mistakes. I'm not an MHRA employee. I work on the Commission of Human Medicines, which give advice to the MHRA, to the licensing authority in the UK. So, of course, medicine safety has really taken a great deal of focus, probably sort of over the last century, really, from a period of time when there was essentially no regulation to a period of the last 50 plus years or so, where actually the Medicines Act, we've had much more control over the manufacturing, distribution, licensing and promotion of medicines. And since obviously we've for a long time had a national sort of authority through what was the Committee on Safety of Drugs, and then over the last 20 years or so through what is now the Commission of Human Medicines. The European Medicines Agency, which of course is the European arm of similar licensing sort of authority in Europe, has been in place since the mid-1990s. And as we can see here is some scattered, of course, some of those drugs that we know have really affected how medicines regulation has changed. And I've got a slide from Phil Routledge's paper in The Lancet that demonstrates some of these incidents. So they say that the last 100 years since has really changed it, and probably I won't go through all of the dates, but of course well known to many of us was the thalidomide, what was classed as the thalidomide disaster, when babies were born with this awful limb defect called phocomelia, literally seal limb, to mothers who had taken thalidomide during pregnancy. Thalidomide widely promoted as a sort of sedating antiemetic at the time, and then of course this recognition that it caused this terrible limb defect, this teratogenic defect. And it was around this time that after the voluntary Dunlop Committee and then the yellow card system that was brought in, of course, we'll talk more about that later, we came to have the sort of regulatory act over which we still ensue now, the 1968. But even despite then, I think people realized that drugs, even when they had been licensed, were still associated with new adverse effects. And this has again really changed the way that we both look at events in trials, but also events during the clinical use of a drug, what we would class now as pharmacovigilance. So the medicines regulator, the MHRA, are there to make sure that we only have marketed products with a positive benefit risk profile. And where this doesn't exist, of course, to take regulatory action. And that occurs throughout the life cycle of the drug. Again, a really important point in modern practice is it's just not a fire and forget. We regulate a drug or have it available, but actually that throughout the product life cycle is that we keep an eye through regular updates of the drug, and we take necessary action if the benefit risk profile changes, either through drug suspension or, of course, actually removal entirely of the marketing authorization. The regulator is also there to communicate information to healthcare professionals and patients so that they can use products effectively and safely, and to also encourage innovation. The MHRA was part of the European regulatory network, and of course, although this now changes, and probably some of the numbers on here out of date, there's a wide network throughout Europe of similar regulators who all have a voice at the European Medicines Agency. And there are a number of committees that sit there. The Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, CHMP, is really, again, sort of the licensing, the equivalent of the Commission of Human Medicines at a European level. The Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee is also there. PRAC is what we call it. And again, that's really looking at the safety signals throughout Europe, and all for medicinal products as we try and think really much more around promising innovative medicines. And the network work as a whole. And I'm going to talk a little bit about European regulation because, of course, as we Brexit, we need to try and make sure that we fit in with the European scene and that we're not therefore behind in terms of the licensing of medicines, and trying to ensure that medicines are got to patients in Great Britain as quickly as they would do throughout Europe. So the MHRA, as the National Competent Authority, has many different arms, like not just the regulation of medicines, but of course devices and blood safety and quality. But really all I'm going to talk about today is the two elements of marketing authorizations and post-marketing safety monitoring, of which of course the yellow card system is an important part. The part of the regulation is also trying to think about clinical trial authorizations, inspections for good medicinal practice, and enforcement and prosecution, for example, through illicit drugs or counterfeit drugs. So they're all part of the MHRA as well, but beyond the scope of this talk. So, as I say, from chemist mind to chemist shop is a long period of time, or from bench to bedside, as some people call it. And of course, many drugs are lost along the way. Regulation actually starts relatively early, and you can see, or this isn't where my titles come from, by the way, is that throughout drug discovery, through translational research, and through then trials of efficacy and safety, is that we then reach the period of marketing authorization. And this is where, of course, this may take a long period of time, although as we've seen, this can be accelerated, and we've been very grateful that, for example, COVID vaccines have actually really accelerated this process from what is often 15 years or more to much shorter periods of time. But generally, it has to, this drug pipeline where we lose many drugs does take some time. And the regulation has to take into account, of course, this body of evidence that's brought up over this long period of time. I'm going to talk very briefly about what the actual hurdles are in terms of before we get to the marketing authorization, which is the period, of course, the license where a drug may be distributed and used within Great Britain. So from the MHRA, there is this body, the Commission of Human Medicines, and the functions of CHM are to advise the Health Minister and the Licensing Authority on matters related to the safety, quality, and efficacy of human medicinal products. And these are the three hurdles that we would consider. The CHM considers the applications that lead to a licensing authority action as appropriate. They would consider representations made either in writing or in verbal by the applicant or a license. For example, if there's a list of questions and from the product authorization that the company may need to respond to. And of course, one of the other the CHM are to promote the collection and investigation of information related to adverse reactions. So that's what the CHM are there for, and it's a group independently selected from the Department of Health and Social Care to advise the Minister, currently chaired by Sir Munir Pirmohamed, who took over last month from Professor Stuart Ralston as the chair of the Commission. Underneath the Commission are a series of expert advisory groups. There's three statutory EAGs, as we call them, pharmacovigilance. So that's the one that looks at drug safety in the UK. And in fact, I'm the current chair of the pharmacovigilance expert advisory group and took over from Sir Munir as he went on to chair the Commission. There's chemistry, pharmacy and standards, and biological and vaccines. But there are other established EAGs. These sometimes sort of change, most of them related to sort of organ-based systems, such as CDEREG, the cardiovascular diabetes, renal respiratory and allergy, GRIDEG, you can see them here, medicines for women's health, MPPEG, oncology, hematology, pediatric medicines, and patient and public engagement. So a number of expert advisory groups. And usually what happens is the chair of each of the expert advisory groups are one of the commissioners of human medicines. So what are the review processes here for new marketing authorizations? Well, these are the three hurdles that we see them here. The principal things we need to look at are the quality of the product, the safety of the product, and the efficacy or effectiveness of the product. And we will look at a lot of different information that goes into each of these, and I'll talk about these in just 1 second. The first hurdle is quality. Quality is really important. Under here is information that I really don't understand. It's around trying to make sure, for example, that manufacturers adopt good medicinal practice, and that actually throughout all of the drug production, that the manufacturing is okay, that they've thought about the excipients, that they've thought about the packaging and the stability throughout life, and started to think through all of the issues, which sometimes, of course, as we see products being manufactured, for example, that might include some degree of drug delivery device, is trying to think about the human factors that are involved in that throughout the whole of the product life cycle. And that's a big hurdle, and the chemistry, pharmacy and standards group will often pore over. There's lots of experts in all aspects of medicinal chemistry, through to pharmaceutical product development, through to stability issues in there that they will look for. And again, a lot of this will cover some detailed analysis of the files on the quality assessment. The second is on safety, and I suppose safety and effectiveness often come together. Data is available from all types and sources, so clearly there'll often be evidence from, for example, preclinical data, and that might include, for example, both in vitro and in vivo animal pharmacology. We'll look at the clinical pharmacology of the product, such as, for example, drug-food interactions, drug-drug interactions. Maybe look at some data that's available from bibliographic evidence of the drug in use. And then, of course, primarily trying to think about early phases, and then ultimately the clinical trials to look at the safety overall of the product. And again, the safety assessment is key. And with that, as I'll come on to a little bit later on, we'll also try and think about not just the safety to date, but actually the safety going forwards in terms of what is known, what isn't known, and therefore how we manage the risks, i.e. the safety risks of products going forward. And lastly, of course, effectiveness. And effectiveness is the clinical drug evaluation. And of course, as you'll know, controlled clinical trials are really the scientific and legal basis to evaluate new drugs. And as we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, really, many more improved methods to evaluate through large-scale, often multinational, multi-center clinical trials as we shift towards evidence-based medicine. And of course, these are really based upon large, often, phase 3 trials, although I haven't really got time to go into it today, but with some of the promising innovative medicines, phase 2 trial evidence can be taken into account for early access procedures. And again, this is a slide, and I mainly show this, this is a slide from my sort of deck, which actually, of course, we may have a few hundred to a few thousand patients in these early phase trial, and that's really important. But when we try and think about the benefit risk profile, then clearly we may not have had the full experience of the thousands of people that might be exposed to a drug as it goes through, which is why even at marketing, safety and effectiveness and the benefit risk profile is still considered in an ongoing basis. So this is really one of, I suppose, the key slides here about what is the review process. And you can see that the dossier for a new drug contains usually sections in this area. So the quality, I've mentioned many of those already. What we really want to do is look at the finished medicinal product and actually are the dose forms acceptable through all of the processes they've gone through. The non-clinical dossier is really, again, important to understand the pharmacology, the pharmacokinetics and the biodistribution of the drug, toxicology, which sometimes includes ecotoxicity and the environmental risk if it's relevant for those particular drugs. The clinical dossier not just contains sort of the information about the clinical trials, but actually, early stage, perhaps PK, PD data, maybe physiological based PK if we've got it, as well as the clinical studies. And then, of course, a biostatistical analysis of all of the data to make sure that actually it's robust in terms of what it's telling us. And then lastly, the risk management plan. And the safety specification includes those risks that are known, that are already identified through perhaps early trials, potential risks, so things that might come out in the wash, but yet still not enough information, and things where there really is a dearth of information, the so-called missing information. And as part of the risk management plan now, very importantly, is the pharmacovigilance plan. And I'll talk a difference between, I suppose, more active pharmacovigilance and routine pharmacovigilance a little bit later. As well as the review process, then underneath the conditions for marketing authorization, clearly we need to see information such as the proposed summary of product characteristics, that data sheet. You'll be aware that these are easily accessible via medicines.org.uk, but really is the information. And we'll particularly, people like myself will look very carefully under the conditions for use, perhaps under section 4.4, and scrutinize the summary of product characteristics, because it is really the healthcare professional sort of culmination of information about the product. There's lay members as well, and they'll look at the patient information leaflet as well as the professional members to make sure that, again, we've got the right information there that's accessible to people that need it. And we'll also look at issues such as labeling, that's relevant, to look at the boxes to make sure that, as it were, it's clear what the instructions are. And then look again at statutory issues of labeling, such as more recently came out, is if it's an opioid, is that it has to have the correct labeling on it to say that it contains opioid and that there's a risk of dependence addiction and withdrawal. So the MHRA and all regulatory agencies will have their own internal teams, and the central assessment teams will pore over the dossiers, over the quality assessors will look obviously at the manufacturing issues, the non-clinical assessors at their relevant section, the clinical assessors, and then the risk management team will look at their assessment. It's then usually, as I say, looked at CPS, which will be looking at mostly the quality issues, the relevant specialty EEGs. So obviously if it's a product that's for use in children, then it'll be looked at by pediatric expert advisory group. And then usually most of the products, certainly in terms of depending upon whether it's a difficult risk management process or not, will come through to the pharmacovigilance EEG. And so, as I say, there's a wide range of specialists that sit on the Commission of Human Medicines. Of course, we sit around a virtual table now, usually on Zoom, and this is a 2-day meeting once a month with additional meetings in between if we need. And there's a wide range of inputs there. As I say, there's lay members, biostatisticians, a range of specialty doctors, some clinical pharmacologists, including myself, pharmacists and chemists, general practitioners, and we will work with the assessors to have a look at the data and make a decision. The one really interesting thing, and I suppose in my role within the Trust as Associate Medical Director, where we have a great responsibility for, of course, the economics of getting drugs, money is never mentioned. It's a very bizarre thing. So not that I'm a singer, but I think there's a song that goes, it's not about the money, money, money. It's certainly not about the money, money, money at the Commission of Human Medicines. And I pointed this out because actually, of course, Zolgensma, I'm not even sure whether I can announce the full name, so I won't try, but is one of the transgenic gene therapies for spinal muscular atrophy. I'm going to say small muscular atrophy, spinal muscular atrophy type 1. And I remembered this because last week it was just on, I think, the radio when I was coming to work about how this drug for £2 million, they over-egged it. It was only £1.79 million had been authorised for use in the UK. Of course, that goes, people sometimes think about the £30,000 per quality adjusted life year is sort of the nice threshold for often authorising a drug. But of course, actually, this is a really important drug that's given to babies that would otherwise have demise and certainly major problems during infancy. And so this single drug, despite it being £1.8 million, has been authorised for use in the UK. But nobody even thought about what it would cost when we were licensing the drug. It is just a drug. Does it fulfill the 3 hurdles of quality, safety, and effectiveness? And cost effectiveness is all different. It's about the health technology assessment that happens on a national basis and is completely divorced from the decision-making process. There's lots of different types of application, but these are sort of, I suppose, the broad ones. Obviously, for new active substances, we need to have a full application. We need the whole of the dossier that I mentioned before, because actually it's new. We don't know too much about it. Whereas actually, if we've got existing active substances, then of course you don't necessarily need to have some of the repeat tests around some of, for example, the pharmacokinetics. So there's an abridged application there. And both types of application are thought of very regularly. So the abridged applications might be for the sort of Me Too drugs. So, existing, generic products of existing drugs. And then you may just need to have comparative pharmacokinetic dissolution data, for example. If existing drugs have been given via new forms, again, we perhaps need some of the preclinical data to ensure that, as it were, that's okay, as well as some of the quality data. So the abridged applications obviously bypass some of the work that full applications need for new active substances. So the routes to market is a bit complicated these days, but I'm going to go back to how Europe did work, and then I'll try and show how that then maps onto how the UK are working now. So traditionally, and still existing across the EU, there are four main routes to market. A national route where each country does their own assessment. And of course, in some ways, that's what the UK will be now doing. So trying to look at authorization in a single country. The other end of the spectrum is a centralized procedure, and as you'll see on the next slide, is that this is actually mandatory in Europe for certain therapeutic areas or products. And this is a single Europe-wide authorization where assessment is coordinated across Europe, and the European Medicines Agency will actually take on this with member states providing the scientific opinion. There's a decentralized procedure, which is where several European countries are involved, and a simultaneous application is made by the marketing authorization holder to several countries at a time. And then the sort of one in between is mutual recognition, which is actually a two-stage process. This is after a national application that actually then the MAH will then ask other countries whether they want to recognize on a mutuality base the drug in those countries. So the centralized procedure, as I mentioned, has developed a mandatory scope, and that's particularly to again try and ensure, rather than cherry picking off individual countries for really important, for example, new active substances in areas such as viral diseases, cancer, diabetes, for medicinal products, and for new biotechnologies, is that these all go via centralized procedures in Europe. Of course, companies have an option for other substances as well to come to a centralized procedure. And immediately, of course, when a drug is licensed via a centralized procedure, then it can be used in all EU member states. Just a little bit about the detail here. So the EMA are the main sort of, as it were, conductors of the orchestra, but they will actually appoint a rapporteur and a co-rapporteur. These are essentially two member states who will take the lead and, as it were, the deputy lead of looking at the product dossier. They'll have a peer reviewer for initial assessment, and that's administered, as I say, by the EMA, and this results in the community authorization. And the summary of product characteristics is granted by the European Commission via the authorization. It's either all or none. No country can say, no, I don't want to have that drug. They all have the ability via CHMP and via PRAC to make comments on each of the products. And that product, therefore, then is the procedure, the centralized procedure that is available throughout the sort of product lifetime. Again, not for necessarily inward digestion, but just to give you an idea. So here we have sort of the procedures, and the first 4 months or so is quite important. It takes that before, as it were, the initial sort of list of questions is drawn up. They then have a period of time that's determined to answer the list of questions, and then the assessment returns. Again, it's another couple of months before then there's any outstanding questions made, and then there's another month or so before a scientific opinion is made. And these are procedural days, not calendar days, because the clock stop may last for several months whilst the company is going away and perhaps answering any major objections or other questions that come out of the initial assessments. And so, as you can see, it will take, maybe 7 or 8 months, and often, of course, with these clock stops, up to a year or more for the procedure to work. But with some, if we want to get some particular drugs, particularly, for example, new active substances in oncology to market, there are accelerated procedures that I'll talk about just very briefly in a short while. So this is what the procedural timelines look like. And in the old days, the Commission of Human Medicines would actually meet and try and look at the circulated rapporteur and co-rapporteur reports, so that again we would be able to think of any questions that we could put to the company as part of the procedures in a centralized procedure, and each of the member states will have a member that sits on CHMP to take those questions to the Commission. I mentioned early access schemes, and this is really important. Again, more recent years is trying to bring new priority medicines to offer support to medicines developers to get drugs to market in a quicker way. And there's various different ways of doing this. There was an early priority medicine scheme. There's, as I say, an accelerated assessment scheme. But probably the most common scheme that people have used is to try and look at EAM schemes. And many of you will have heard of early access to medicine schemes. Particularly, these are important for those conditions where there is a clear unmet medical need. And as we go towards greater stratification of medicine, of course, actually the sort of orphan designation for EAM schemes becomes even more important. So once a drug has been identified as a promising innovative medicine, an EAM scheme will work if, for example, it is life-threatening or serious debilitating, which is why often in the cancer area, particularly for example, metastatic or perhaps for second or third line in therapy, that there may be an unmet medical need. Obviously, the product needs to have a promise that it's likely to offer a benefit or a significant advantage over and above existing treatments. And again, of course, the benefit-risk balance must be positive in this case. The applicant, again, must be able to ensure the quality. And again, EAMS schemes are there to work, and whilst they will be put in often whilst the marketing authorization holder is putting in perhaps for or completing further stages of, for example, phase 3 trials to actually get the full sort of license. So in terms of current Great British national routes to market, there are now new routes to market through the MHRA. And again, you can read more about this on the MHRA website. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these, but essentially it's to try and map onto the European scheme for example, reliance routes. But there are other ways that we're doing things, such as rolling reviews, trying to think about accelerated assessment, which of course tries to cut short, maybe to 5 months, the assessment of a new medicinal product. And a new type of sort of EAMS, which is the innovative licensing and access pathway, where actually instead of actually waiting for the company to try and this is a promising innovative medicine, is to really encourage innovation by providing tailored support throughout the product development life cycle. So here it is, and I think that this is really important. I mean, this is fairly radical as regulators go to try and provide a route to approval, so that actually very early on engagement between companies and the MHRA, as well as other partners such as the NHS, patients and developers, that actually trying to think about perhaps novel trial design and really trying to get early decision making in the drug development pathway is really important here. Slightly more boring, but of course procedurally necessary, is the reliance procedures, and these are much shorter procedures because actually they rely upon decisions that are being made elsewhere. There's a so-called unfettered access procedure, and again, probably not time to go into this in detail, but this is available because the MHRA also works in Northern Ireland, who have representation at a European level. And so there can be a sort of a mutual recognition there for drugs that are approved in Northern Ireland. The mutual recognition decentralized procedures is again a way of piggybacking onto those two procedures that I say that occur with other European member states through their procedures, and instead of actually looking at all the information as a brand new dossier for this country alone, is that actually applications together with any information gained from the procedures that have occurred in other European countries are triaged for issues around the quality safety and effectiveness hurdles. And then lastly, the reliance procedure on centralized procedures, again, will be doing pretty much the same when the MAHs are being encouraged to seek recognition in Great Britain of drugs that are already being taken through the European centralized procedures. And so I think that this is going to change the way we work. It's very early days at the moment, and it's unclear in some ways about how the triage of issues will occur. But it's, again, really important that actually we have such procedures in place to ensure that, that certainly GB is not behind the curve in terms of getting medicines to our patients. The last sort of review, and this has perhaps been exemplified best via the vaccine licensing, is the so-called rolling review. Now, the vaccine licensing was done under the special scheme 147, but the rolling review, I think, was exemplified here, because instead of waiting for the full dossier, for the quality dossier and the preclinical and the clinical and the risk management plan to all be submitted at the same time, is the applicant for a new marketing authorization submits increments to the agency for the dossier so that they can be pre-assessed and again rolled on, so that actually we, as more information becomes available, we can start to see the part of the dossier rather than waiting just for the full dossier submission. And again, this is going to be really important to get innovative medicines to patients in a quick way, and certainly was, as I say, exemplified via the COVID vaccine rollout. So as I sort of think about licensing, why is this relevant to pharmacovigilantes that might be there? Well, of course, we all need to manage risk. In some ways, for individual practitioners, the risk is taken out of our hands. It's done by the regulators in advance. But I think we as healthcare professionals working with our patients and the public have a need to actually try and ensure that we use medicine safely and effectively within the health service. Now, I prefer, when we're thinking about it, is harm-benefit profile, because in some ways risk is just the probability, often thought of as adverse outcomes, although there's a probability that patients get better when we treat them with drugs. But let's just think about risk as the probability that a particular adverse outcome occurs during a quantum of exposure to hazard. So is this crocodile going to actually, the risk of this person being bitten is dependent on the time that they're, as it were, between the jaws, I think is how I would put it. And there's always a chance of benefit or a chance of harm, and the benefit is the outcome, whereas the risk is the chance of an outcome, and the two aren't really comparable. So I will often talk about a harm-benefit balance. And when we discuss risk management, we are usually thinking about all of the ways that we can try and tip the harm-benefit balance in the correct order. And in fact, partly because of time, I won't go through this, but you can read Jeff Aronson and Robin Furner's excellent article on benefit-harm balance in drug therapy. It's slightly old, but it's a sort of seminal work in terms of actually trying to think about these sorts of issues. And the important thing is, at a European way, is that actually, as I said at the beginning, that every drug must come with a risk management plan developed through a sort of risk management system. And this has gone on now over the last 20 or so years, is to actually try and think about that whole set of pharmacovigilance activities and interventions that can identify, characterize, prevent, or at least minimize risks related to medicinal products. And you'll all know these. They come out, don't they, all the time. The clozapine white cell monitoring scheme, the Clozaril monitoring scheme, because of the risk of drug-induced agranulocytosis. The retinoids and pregnancy prevention program, and now, of course, the more important valproate pregnancy prevention program, are all in place and are really important tools within the risk management plan. And the plan itself describes the system that is in place, and as I say, must be put in place by the manufacturer. And you can go and have a look at this in good pharmacovigilance practice. There are ways of trying to consider what a risk management plan should contain. And again, you'll find information on either the EMA or the MHRA website if you're interested in these issues. But it does, for example, define what the marketing authorization holder must do, even at the point of licensing, further to monitor and study risks. And that might be, for example, putting on some sort of post-authorization safety study. It might be, for example, trying to think about information that's available to patients through perhaps patient information leaflets or patient plans. It may include, for example, the information that's going to go out to healthcare professionals through education and training. And all of this must be put into the risk management plan. When's it needed? Well, it's for all new marketing authorizations, so new active substances, but also, as I mentioned before, even for the abridged applications, if it's significant new indications, extension to different populations, or it's new routes, then one has to try and think about the additional or varied risk that exist with that. Any significant change to an existing marketing authorization must be there. And importantly, again, one of the things that the Commission do is try and think about reclassification. So, for example, when a drug goes from prescription only to, for example, pharmacy available, or from pharmacy available to general sales list, well, in there goes additional risks because of perhaps the availability of those medicines. So that is where risk management plans are needed. And of course, and this is why it's really important, is spontaneous ADR reporting through, for example, the yellow card system is one of the really important tools within the pharmacovigilance toolbox. But there are others, and people may want to do safety studies, and that might, for example, be looking at a very specific issue such as drug-drug interactions. It may be just looking at a registry, for example, of patients and looking at the and harms during use in practice, particularly if, for example, it's orphan medicinal products or orphan conditions where there's small numbers. We'll put in a registry study. There may be specific monitoring studies, such as, and we've seen this with the vaccines, but they've existed for a while, and the prescription event monitoring studies, often undertaken by the Drug Safety Research Unit, are there. And actually, routine pharmacovigilance always includes periodic safety updates, which have to be submitted at regular time intervals by the marketing authorization throughout the whole of the product lifespan. Patient information, really important, and you'll know this. This is a sort of patient information leaflet, but actually not only the patient information leaflet, but the risk management plan has to include lay summaries that includes the risk management and any additional risk minimization tools, as I mentioned, patient cards or checklists or information resources that are available to patients. And this is a slightly complicated slide, but it's just to try and get an idea, particularly around trying to think of, there is what's known, and then there's the what's not known, the known unknowns, as it were, of this. Who wasn't studied in the target population? Is it going to be used in children or adolescents, in which case we may need to have a pediatric investigation plan and risk management there? Was the drug not studied in patients with, for example, severe renal impairment, in which case actually that is sort of missing information? And these are all, potentially can be put in either as identified risks, potential risks, or missing information. They're all safety concerns, and the risk management therefore has to be dynamic and proportionate to those risks in practice. So, as I mentioned, pharmacovigilance is what certainly the Yellow Card Centre in the West Midlands, as well as probably many of you, are all about as medication safety officers, as pharmacovigilance pharmacists, as interested others. And the MHRA, like all national competent authorities, relies upon signals of safety. And of course, that's why we encourage adverse drug reactions to be reported, because they may come up as safety signals nationally, and they come from not just spontaneous reports, but also new clinical studies, scientific literature, and of course some of the post-authorization safety studies or registries that I'd mentioned on the last slide. So the yellow card scheme, a really important part of this. It's secure, it's spontaneous, and it's reliant upon you submitting suspicions for ADRs, providing early warning through, again, really clever work that happens nationally to try and look at the data and try and consider early safety signals in the drug use in the real world. So please do report. You know, I wouldn't be a yellow card seminar without me putting a slide up like this for, even if well recognized, life-threatening, those that result in or prolong hospitalization. So that's pretty much any ADR that occurs on my ward, because usually it means that people stay longer. And remember, report suspicion. You don't have to prove causality, in case to report a yellow card via the Yellow Card website, where the majority of them are done, or you can download the app onto your smartphone. I think there are even copies in the back of the BNF if you can still find one in your clinical area. So, two last slides of sort of key concepts is pharmacovigilance is moving very much from a sort of reactive to a proactive approach. And it's less focus on finding harm and more on extending our knowledge of the safety of products. So we clearly need, at the point of a licensing decision, what's already known and unknown about safety, and then risk management planning is about how that safety knowledge uses all available data in the future. And again, very much tailored to specific products. So that's my sort of key thoughts about modern pharmacovigilance. I think actually the regulator, particularly the MHRA, has got a lot of challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. We've got the new sort of life sciences agenda, where we're trying to get products, particularly from perhaps small and medium enterprises, out, available to patients, early access to promising products. Obviously, challenges such as global population, let alone public health, such as coronavirus. But there are other issues such as the illegal supply and internet provision of medicines. But as I say, we're in a very strong position, and I think the regulator is seen in a very positive light in terms of all the work it's done through COVID. And I hope that many of you will agree that under challenging circumstances, they've done a really good job, particularly, as I say, at licensing vaccines and being, first in the world really in some of these areas to get products to patients to save lives. Thank you very much for your attention. As Christopher said, hopefully you put some questions in the chat box. If you need to leave, my email is on the screen there. But we hope to have an online discussion now, and after the seminar, we will send round a survey. And last of all, follow our Twitter channel, and don't forget, if in doubt, fill one out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie, for that comprehensive and thorough review of how medicines are licensed. I've been working in this field for a large number of years now and learned quite a bit from it, so thank you. And also, you've been competing against the EMA's press conference this lunchtime, who I think have said they will conclude their investigations into the AstraZeneca vaccine by Thursday. Does anyone have any questions for Jamie? I have one to kick off. I've heard of lots about teething problems or existential threat, depending on whether you're a government minister or a Cornish trawler. Have the new processes been subject to any teething problems yet, or are they still yet to bed in?
I think they're still yet to bed in. I was interested. I mean, the country in some ways is in a very interesting position. It has to sort of deal with these issues. I think that some of the new procedures are really are probably going to be better than what we had in the past. But actually, what we don't want to do is put off any global pharmaceuticals from actually bringing drugs to the UK, because it's just seen as too much effort. So I think it's about trying to make as efficient entry into the UK market as possible, but that stays to the rigorous sort of evaluation that the MHRA would like. I think that's yet to be seen. I think, of course, it's both critical to our patients, but also critical generally to, of course, maintaining our standards. And I think that balance is a difficult one, but certainly no teething problems yet. And in fact, everything that's happened that I've heard so far about the new GB licensing procedures have been very positive.
Thank you. Any more questions, or does anybody wish to raise something in discussion?
Hi Jamie, it's Karen. I just want to say with regards to the new safety concerns that other countries' regulators have come up with the vaccines, how would we respond to patients asking us how the regulators have come to different decisions?
It's an interesting how you respond to people saying how do they make different decisions. I think that the easiest thing to do if you're concerned, of course, is to suspend a license. But whether it's easy or right are two different things. It is very difficult to know. And if you look at some of the data, and I know that people will have seen tweets, or I even saw something on Facebook when I was glancing yesterday around this, then the observed versus expected thrombotic events following vaccination actually favor the fact that actually vaccination is probably protective rather than causing adverse drug reactions. And nevertheless, actually, that's taking into account all of the potentially the risks of harm from the drug without taking into account the risk of harm from, of course, developing COVID-19 pneumonitis, which, of course, is associated with a huge rate of thrombosis through which we know through its use. And in fact, there was also potentially some people coming up with the idea that actually maybe some of the people that have been vaccinated that have got VTEs might actually have had coexisting COVID. So I would certainly, I think explaining to patients, absolute risks is really important. And of course, there's many more experts on, on data communication, public communication around these things than I am. But I think most people would understand that, if you start to bring in not just the risk of the vaccine and the VTE, but the risk of the disease and its risk of VTE, then hopefully many people would understand that. Any other questions? I don't know. Somebody might have a different thought to me. I don't know whether people actually think that we're doing the wrong thing.
Are pharmacovigilance strategies for different regulators, were they all set out in the same way or in a similar way? Because obviously it's a different pharmacovigilance strategy if you suspended the license.
I don't think so. I mean, we had a very good pharmacovigilance strategy in the UK, I think, to try and think about proactive vaccine surveillance. And this is not something that's come up. I mean, it's very good that we've had thousands of reports, and of course there will be thousands of reports when you're giving out 25 million doses. But I don't think certainly. The regulator has not seen a strong, well, I don't believe they've seen a strong signal. Otherwise, they would be doing something about it. And so probably the UK, other than Israel, has got a pretty good view around the benefit harm profile of each of the vaccines, at this stage. And I think you wouldn't see, my personal view, sitting from the outside is that the UK are usually pretty vigilant and actually would be very keen to suspend if actually they thought that there was any risk. So the fact that they've actually stood fast and said, no, we don't believe that there are any risks, although I know they're still analysing the data at the moment, or they're reanalyzing it, but all the data's been there for some weeks, months, and being looked at.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, just some housekeeping. I've put a link to a feedback form in the chat, and we'd be grateful if you would fill that out. And if you have any suggestions for other topics we could cover, then do let us know. As I said, this talk will be available on our YouTube channel later this week, and but for the next one in this series of ours is on the 4th of May, when Dr. Anthony Cox will be talking topically about vaccine safety. So look out for an Eventbrite ad for that on our Twitter feed. And thank you for your attendance this lunchtime.
Indeed, thank you.